Hello, everyone. My name is Chad Cunningham, the Director of Loss Control here at Insurance Board. I would like to welcome you to this time of learning titled Generating Artificial Intelligence for Churches. Before our speaker starts, there are a couple guidelines I would like to share. One, this webcast will be recorded and placed on our website under the Online Learning tab, along with additional documents for future viewing. You will receive an email with a link and additional documents within the week after the webinar. The chat function has been turned off. We'll be using the question and answer function. You can find those at the bottom of the screen. We will save all questions to the end of the presentation. Our speaker did receive some questions ahead of time, and she will be answering those throughout her presentation, but please feel free to ask more questions, and we will share those at the end. And again, restrooms are down your hallway or next door or wherever it may be where you're at. It's always important we know that. So today, I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker. With us today is Heather Kimmel. She's the General Counsel for United Church of Christ. Heather has served as the General Counsel of United Church of Christ since 2015. In that capacity, she regularly counsels the corporations of the national ministries and the conferences on issues related to governance, religious life, liberty, intellectual property, tax, employment, and ecclesiastical oversight processes. Before joining the national ministries, she practiced in 2 large law firms in Cleveland. She frequently speaks on church law-related matters and maintains a blog on the UCC National Ministries website. We're excited to have Heather with us today. And without further ado, Heather, they are yours.
Thank you, Chad. Thanks to the Insurance Board for putting this together. So welcome to Generative Artificial Intelligence for Churches, Managing Risks and Policy Development. I am coming to you today from my home office in Cleveland, where we are sitting under a heat dome. So the temperature here is at about 90 degrees, and I imagine many of you are in the same situation. So I hope that you have found a way to keep cool this afternoon as we are learning about this. I have been involved in educating folks about generative artificial intelligence for about a year. Most recently, I taught a continuing legal education program at a Georgetown conference on generative artificial intelligence policy development for churches. So Gen AI, as you will hear me refer to it throughout this session, is a rapidly changing technology, and the laws and the regulations surrounding it will also be changing rapidly. Because this technology is already heavily in use and may be actually in use by your church staff now, I recommend developing a flexible policy and updating it as required, rather than kind of waiting to see how state or federal regulation or case law shakes out in this area. It is a technology that is here to stay, and the best management of risk comes with developing an understanding of the technology and its capabilities, as well as its weaknesses. So at the outset, I want to address a couple of questions that I received about what the best tools are for particular purposes. Unfortunately, I'm not able to make recommendations on specific software or tools today, but I'm here to discuss how you can develop a policy that will help you evaluate the tools that you are using to manage risk to your church. So unfortunately, I can't answer questions like what is the best tool to make reels or whether you should be using ChatGPT in your church. But hopefully, as we talk and we talk about some of the risks, you'll develop an understanding of what you need to evaluate in the tools that you are using. Okay, first I'm going to share with you a little disclaimer. The information in this presentation isn't legal advice, and attending the presentation doesn't create an attorney-client relationship with me. So if your church has legal questions, you should consult your church's attorney. The slides will be provided for download for registered viewers. If you want to share this information, I would ask that you direct folks to the link on the Insurance Board's website to view the recorded program. Those folks will then have the opportunity to download the slides and the policy development checklist for themselves. I'm asking you not to distribute the slides to others or to copy and reuse them without further permission. And that's just because I want to avoid the misconception that the information in the slides is what is important in the program. The oral presentation is going to contain a lot of information, and the slides are really just to highlight that and to keep us on track. So thanks for your cooperation in that. Okay, so what exactly is generative artificial intelligence? I am willing to bet that the folks in this webinar today are probably at many different stages of familiarity with the technology. We have folks on this Zoom who have heard of ChatGPT but never used it. And we probably have folks on this call who are skilled at using language, music, and image generators in their ministry. The definition on the screen comes from the executive order issued by the White House at the end of October of last year. The federal government is starting to formulate policy recommendations and regulations on Gen AI, and states in some cases are actually moving much faster. Now, this definition is pretty long and the three parts makes it complicated. So a more intuitive way to think about it is that Gen AI is a system that's trained by developers on existing materials to produce similar materials in response to requests or queries that are called prompts. And if you've played around with ChatGPT at all, you know how this works. You can ask ChatGPT to write an email, song lyrics, or even a sermon that falls within the parameters of your request. In fact, what I'd like to do before we really get into this is to do a little poll to see whether folks are using this technology. So I'm asking you to just pick the response that best describes the level of your use and familiarity with ChatGPT or music or image generators. And then we'll kind of put the results on the screen and everyone can see where everyone else is. So I'll give about 15 seconds for folks to answer that. All right, and let's see what happened. Okay, so we really are kind of all over the place here. It looks like just about half of you are interested but have been unsure of whether you really want to try it. And another almost half of you have either played around with it or use it regularly. There's a couple folks on this call who are not interested in using it at all, and we'll talk about that some too. Okay, Chad, okay, thanks for taking that down. So listen though, if you have not played around with ChatGPT, I encourage you to do so. I encourage you to do that outside of your work technology and taking into account the safeguards that we'll discuss here. I think that if we have a fear or a distrust of a technology, that one of the ways that we can learn about what the risks actually are to become familiar with it. So if you haven't played around with ChatGPT yet, give it a try. The output can be amazing. It can also be amazingly awful. And some of that actually depends on how skilled the user is in entering prompts. There's a lot of information out there that is available on prompt engineering, which is the process of structuring your queries of Gen AI models to get the best results. If you decide that your church will be using this technology, providing prompt engineering training to staff really can increase the quality of your results. Okay, how does Gen AI work? We talked a little bit about this already, but Gen AI models are trained by the developing company by inputting existing digitized works like books, websites, music, and images into the AI model. The Gen AI model learns from these inputs and is programmed to create similar content in response to prompts or queries from users. So for example, a ChatGPT user can type in a question for ChatGPT to answer, like, what are the teachings of the Catholic faith on tithing? Or it can instruct ChatGPT to create content using certain parameters, like write a 3,000 word sermon in the style of a Protestant minister based on this week's revised common lectionary gospel reading. So you can get pretty detailed with these prompts. Image generators and music generators also create outputs like videos, art, and music in response to the appropriate prompts. Depending on the Gen AI model, you might be able to even refine and revise the output with additional prompts. Other applications might integrate Gen AI for specific uses, like assisting in human resource management or researching and drafting legal memoranda. One fairly common use of Gen AI technology today is meeting note takers that will automatically generate meeting notes and follow-up items at your Zoom or similar video conference meetings. So what can you do with it? Gen AI can do some pretty amazingly creative things, and it can also create efficiencies. You can use it to conduct research, to draft documents and communications, and to analyze data. It can be used to produce music and graphics that are royalty-free because they aren't copyrighted. But some of the uses have resulted in highly problematic outputs, especially when it comes to emulating the appearance and the voice of human beings. I think it's safe to say that most folks on the webinar are probably familiar with the concept of a deep fake video. These are artificially created but extremely convincing videos. Deep fakes are being used to make it appear as though politicians and celebrities, and yes, even religious figures, have done or said things that they did not actually say or do. You may have seen images of the Pope playing basketball, for example. While I wouldn't necessarily characterize that as a deep fake, it is one of the ways that this technology is being used to kind of make photos look like something happened that didn't actually happen. Deep fakes are also being used to bully, harass, and defame ordinary individuals through artificially created pornography. Gen AI voice technology can be used in other ways as well. So recently, CNN covered the experience of a high school principal who was recorded using discriminatory language. He was put on leave for 3 months while the situation was investigated, and the recording turned out to have been created by a disgruntled worker using Gen AI technology. So this person's life was profoundly affected by a recording that, according to the investigation, wasn't even that well done. I don't need to make up ways to scare people about Gen AI. I think the news media is full of stories that do that already. But remember, the fact that some folks are misusing this technology doesn't mean that it has to be rejected. It can be very useful. I'll apologize in advance. Apparently, we are having a large thunderstorm roll in. So if you hear background noise, that may be what it is. All right. Okay, what can churches do with it? I think the possibility for the use of Gen AI in churches is almost limitless. Writing content for newsletters, blogs, and websites. We are seeing more and more social media posts, both within churches and outside of churches, that are written almost entirely by artificial intelligence. Generating music or images that can be used without a license. Those of you who read my blog know that I have a passion for copyright compliance, and I am always telling you, get licenses for the music that you stream, get licenses for the photographs that you post on your website. So Gen AI allows the possibility of generating suitable images without having to license them from a third party. Managing data. Churches have a lot of data, member data, donor data, employee data. Some churches may even keep some data on their outreach ministry users. AI might be able to help you organize and analyze that information. Developing educational materials, even writing sermons and worship resources. Now, I've used ChatGPT to write a sermon, and it was pretty bad. But I think that some folks on this call with some prompt engineering and editing can probably come up with something that will be able to pass muster on a Sunday morning. You wouldn't be sitting here, however, if those uses didn't come with some risks. These are the legal and ethical risks that we're going to talk about today. Copyright protection and infringement, data security and privacy, discrimination, plagiarism, transparency, and the replacement of human workers. I want to talk for a minute now about the replacement of human workers because I received a question in advance of the webinar on that. And the question said, can you discuss the labor implications for occupations like translators? Put bluntly, how serious is the threat to our livelihoods in your estimation? With respect to translators specifically, I do think there's already a threat and that some will try to move fully toward artificial intelligence in the translating realm. But I do not think it will be a replacement for humans in terms of the work product. It will be a question of what inaccuracies folks are willing to accept in exchange for basically what is the lowered cost of using AI. And I think that is true across the board. Standards of acceptability would have to be changed. And that's largely because of the #1 risk of Gen AI. Gen AI outputs can be and often are wrong. If you read the terms of service for ChatGPT, and I'm sure everyone here routinely reads their licensing terms of service, so nod along with me if that's true for you. Their terms of service actually says, output may not always be accurate. You should not rely on output from our services as a sole source of truth or factual information, or as a substitute for professional advice. So there are at least 2 acknowledged ways that Gen AI can be wrong. First, the model could be trained on materials that are inaccurate or not factual, and it'll deliver those bad facts back in response to a prompt. Recently, there was kind of a funny story about Google AI suggesting adding glue to pizza sauce to help cheese stick to pizza. Apparently, Google AI pulled this from a really old Reddit thread, and I think the ultimate investigation was that the Reddit post had been made by an 11-year-old. So that was bad information into the AI. Additionally, one of the help articles on the OpenAI website, OpenAI, for those of you who aren't familiar, that is the company that owns ChatGPT. So one of the help articles on the OpenAI website acknowledges that ChatGPT will occasionally make up facts or hallucinate outputs. And I use the language hallucinate because that is what the industry calls it. So I'm sure that someone besides me heard about the lawyers who were sanctioned by the court for filing a brief that was drafted using ChatGPT and contained citations to cases that didn't actually exist. So that made national news. That is an example of ChatGPT hallucinating or making up its own facts. If you use a Gen AI tool to take notes at an online meeting and you review those notes, you will no doubt find inaccuracies there as well. I had to laugh at reviewing one of the meetings that someone used to take notes. It was a UCC related meeting, and the AI tool really could not understand our inside baseball lingo and all of our abbreviations. So that was kind of funny, but it was still wrong. Gen AI outputs can also cause a user to allow the Gen AI model's judgment and characterization of certain aspects of writing to be substituted for the user's own judgment. So for example, if you ask Gen AI to write a grant report using certain data and you don't review it carefully, it may inaccurately characterize the mission of the grant or include language that sounds good, but really just isn't part of the organization's mission or purpose. So you have to be very careful with that. And I think similar issues can be true with occupations like translation. There's a real human understanding needed to be able to translate a language. The words can be translated by AI. I don't think anyone disputes that. Whether the meaning can be accurately translated is something that I think probably can't be done at the level that a human being can do it. I know that's not a complete answer or maybe even a satisfactory answer to that individual's question. So if you're listening, I hope that you will accept that. I wish that I had a crystal ball to tell you how that would shake out at the end of the day, but I don't. Okay, let's talk about copyright. We're going to consider 3 questions in the area of copyright. The first is, are works a church produces using Gen AI copyrightable and registrable? And the second is, are a church's rights in its own works infringed by a Gen AI company using the works to train its model? And third, does a church's use of text, images, or music produced by a Gen AI model infringe on others' copyrights? Okay, first let's talk about copyright registration. Again, I've spoken and written a number of places about copyright, and this isn't a copyright webinar. So if you need copyright basics, please go back and look up those articles and videos that I've done on that, because this is not the basics of copyright. But I will remind you here, even though copyright registration isn't required for copyright to attach to a work, registration is required to enforce the copyright. So if a person is using a work produced by the church without permission, a copyright infringement lawsuit is generally the only way to sue for damages and stop the use. And for that, the work has to be registered with the Copyright Office. It's important that you're aware the US Copyright Office will not register works that are produced by a Gen AI model. If your church generally produces books and music that are registered, using Gen AI could impact your ability to protect those works because you will not be able to register them and sue to stop their use by others. If you can't register them, the value may be reduced for those works. The ability to license the works may be impacted as well because folks won't get a license for a work for which the copyright can't be enforced. So for many churches, protecting these assets is a question of stewardship. If your church has a publishing house, if it produces religious texts, artwork, puts out collaborations of music by church musicians or choirs, or has authored educational materials, be very aware of the implications of using Gen AI and creating these for your ability to protect these works by registering them. The Copyright Office has guidelines on registering works that were created using Gen AI. If a work has elements that were authored by a human, or that sufficient human creativity has been applied to, it will register those elements. So when you're thinking forward to developing your church's policy, your policy might require that folks using Gen AI significantly edit the outputs to meet the Copyright Office's guidelines for registration so that your materials can be protected. Or you may go one step further, and if those materials are being created, your policy might prohibit the use of AI in creating those materials so that you can register those copyrights and protect the works. The second question is whether Gen AI companies are infringing on the copyrights of churches who own these materials by training their models on the materials without permission. If materials are available online, there is a very good possibility that a Gen AI model has already been trained on it. These models use all kinds of technologies to take materials and train their models on them without permission. So this is a question that's currently being litigated. And this was also a specific question that was submitted by a webinar registrant who brought up the New York Times lawsuit. For those of you who are not familiar, New York Times is suing Microsoft and OpenAI, the owner of ChatGPT, for copyright infringement because the Gen AI model was trained on copyrighted content owned by the New York Times. OpenAI and Microsoft are being sued by a number of copyright owners. There's a company called Anthropic that is also being sued. Many of the lawsuits that Gen AI companies are facing right now are by owners of copyrighted material claiming their copyrights are infringed by training the models on their materials. We don't have an answer yet, and it might be several years before the law is settled on this. New statutes and regulations may be enacted, and that could affect the ongoing litigation as well. Even if we don't have a settled state of the law on this issue yet, some of the ramifications that we can see are the diminishment in value of the original works, because why buy a work if you can just ask ChatGPT to produce something similar to it? In the lawsuit against the company that I mentioned previously called Anthropic, plaintiffs alleged in their complaint that Anthropic's Gen AI model, which is called Claude, writes songs that directly copy all or a portion of copyrighted song lyrics that are owned by the plaintiffs. This occurs even when the prompt doesn't ask for lyrics to a particular song. So for example, and this example was included in the lawsuit, when prompted to write a short piece of fiction in the style of Louis Armstrong, the output allegedly generated a response that contained large portions of the lyrics to Armstrong's song, "What a Wonderful World." But the output didn't acknowledge the title, the authorship, or the ownership of these lyrics. So these models can also produce materials in the style of particular religious leaders, which may cause confusion about the actual human being's message, or in the style of a particular musician, or even using a particular church's theology. We talked a little bit at the beginning about deep fakes, and I think those should be a concern for prominent religious leaders, especially. Someone in advance of the webinar also asked whether there was a serious prospect for the passage of strong regulations on AI, either in the US or in the EU. And this seems like a good time to address that question. The regulatory landscape in the US is currently a patchwork of state statutes and regulations. States are moving more quickly on this than the federal government. Tennessee, for example, just passed the Elvis Act, which stands for Ensuring Likeness, Voice, and Image Security. And that statute builds on an existing law protecting rights to a person's likeness by including their voice. Other states have passed laws relating to discrimination by artificial intelligence. There is no kind of overarching federal regulation at this point. There is the blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights that is put out by the White House, but that doesn't constitute binding policy. It's more of a white paper. Congress, I think, is still currently discussing 2 bills that would establish publicity, the right to publicity, as a federal right. So the Senate has the Nurture Originals, Foster Art, and Keep Entertainment Safe Act. So that's No Fakes, the No Fakes Act, which would specifically prevent the unauthorized digital replicas of individuals' names, faces, and voices. And then the House has the No Artificial Intelligence, Fake Replicas, and Unauthorized Duplications. So that's the No AI Fraud Act. And that seeks similarly to establish a framework at the federal level for that. The challenge that we have when states move faster than the federal government is a challenge of compliance, because companies have to comply with multiple different state laws. And we see this in privacy legislation too, when you have a company that's operating in multiple states or nationwide or internationally, and they have to comply with a number of different laws that aren't the same. The executive order that the White House issued in October kind of makes it seem like this is going to be a policy priority, but only time will tell. I'll speak on the EU just briefly. The EU recently passed the EU Artificial Intelligence Act in March. It prohibits certain types of AI systems. It imposes some obligations on systems that are high risk. It imposes obligations on AI models that have systemic risks, and it gives measures for dealing with AI systems that have national risk. I am not an EU expert, and I am not certain of the priority enforcement for that, but that act does exist. So I hope that that helps to answer that question that individual submitted. The third question is whether a church's use of Gen AI output infringes on others' copyrights. That's another unsettled legal question. To my knowledge, there is currently no litigation where a copyright owner is suing an end user. That is someone who is using the technology like you and I would use it to create works. So to my knowledge, there's no current lawsuit where a copyright owner is suing an end user who's used, ChatGPT to create a work for infringement. There was a case where George Carlin's estate, for those of you not familiar, George Carlin was a comedian. His estate sued some folks who generated a final comedy show by George Carlin long after he died. That case ultimately settled, but I do think we will see more lawsuits against end users in the future for that. The output that you receive in response to a prompt may be very similar to a copyrighted work, and it may even include portions of copyrighted works. But as we saw in the Anthropic lawsuit, where the example of What a Wonderful World was used, the Gen AI model is not going to cite its source in generating the output, which means that you need to be especially diligent in ensuring that copyrights are not infringed. So some human element of research is going to have to go into that to protect you from an infringement claim. We're going to move into talking about data security and privacy now. So as we've already talked about several times, developing a Gen AI model requires data to train that model. In addition to using the copyrighted works discussed previously, Gen AI companies have gathered vast amounts of data from the internet without the knowledge or the permission of the owners of that data to train their models. And some Gen AI companies are being sued for this practice as well. So there's the copyright infringement lawsuits, and then there's the using our data without our permission lawsuits. These claims are still being litigated. Some Gen AI models, including ChatGPT, allow end users like you and me to upload data into the model, which can then be prompted for outputs based on that data. This technology can increase efficiency in everyday tasks like reporting, creating communications, and organizing the data, but without safeguards, data uploaded into the Gen AI model can be used by the Gen AI company to train the model, which may then be used by other organizations and individuals. So these other users might receive your data in response to their own prompts, which would result in disclosure of sensitive data, including personal information and confidential company information. So again, read those terms of service. It's really important. Churches should carefully examine terms of service for Gen AI models and understand what the model will do with uploaded data. Information about a church's members, donors, employees, and users of a church's outreach ministries could be at risk. And we'll talk a little bit more about how a church can manage this risk through its policy in just a bit. My understanding now is that ChatGPT has an enterprise model, which would contain your data to your work environment. So that's a possibility for those of you who want to become heavy-duty users of that. Not sure what the expense is there. There is also options to kind of turn off the training on ChatGPT when you are using ChatGPT. So just be very careful that you are reading the terms of service and how to avoid training the model on your data if that is a concern for you. We're going to move into discrimination. The output of Gen AI models can exhibit bias and discrimination because the data on which the AI model was trained includes biased data. The training data includes historical text and images that perpetuate discrimination and data sets that over or underrepresent groups of people. The algorithm that's used by the AI model might factor in unconscious biases of the programmer, and even the initial selection of the training data is going to be subject to human bias. So a study that was published in 2023 found that the image generator Midjourney returned images in response to prompts that perpetuated age, sex, and race bias. So for example, the image outputs for prompts for journalist, reporter, and correspondent were exclusively light-skinned. Businesses other than churches are beyond the scope of this webinar, but I will say that if your church has a related business that is using Gen AI, be aware of outputs that may discriminate against protected categories where the church or its business is subject to laws prohibiting discrimination. Some states have enacted laws that limit the use of artificial intelligence in making hiring decisions or other eligibility determinations to prevent discrimination. Churches and their related businesses might be subject to these laws, so know the law in your jurisdiction. Some churches also have theological beliefs and public statements or policies against discrimination based on categories that include race, sex, gender identity, and socioeconomic class. And we'll see when we talk about policy development that churches using Gen AI most definitely should require humans to review that output for issues of bias and discrimination. The next risk that we will talk about is plagiarism and transparency. A question I often get is, isn't plagiarism just copyright? No, plagiarism is different than copyright in that plagiarism is an ethical concern and copyright infringement is a legal concern. But just like in the copyright concern, Gen AI models can produce outputs that are very similar to existing works, and that can lead to claims of plagiarism in sermon writing and other works that are produced by church employees. That's why it's really important to have careful human review of the output for these issues. Using Gen AI models to draft resources, educational texts, and communications without disclosing that your church is using it can also lead to claims of transparency in church and spiritual leadership. Another question that came in prior to the webinar was whether a pastor needs to disclose that they use ChatGPT in writing liturgies and sermons. The first question is disclose to whom? Are you disclosing it to the church leaders? Are you disclosing it to the congregation? Are you putting a broader disclosure statement on the places where it's streamed or recorded? In the context of transparency, my best advice is to know your church and also if there's a policy to follow it. Failing to disclose can sow feelings of distrust and division in congregations if they inadvertently learn that Gen AI was used to create works that are integral to the church. Churches may also have theological beliefs or public statements relating to concerns about Gen AI displacing human workers, or being used to create works that church members believe should be created and stewarded by human minds and hearts and guided by the movement of the divine spirit. So in this realm, one question that's been raised is whether the bodies in churches with authority for ordination or authorization should be using plagiarism detection software or have a policy against those seeking ordination or authorization using Gen AI and drafting the necessary theological papers to seek that ordination. I can't answer what your policy should or should not be, but I can recommend that a church consider its ministerial ethics codes, its theological beliefs, its resolutions, and other statements of witness in developing a policy on the use of this technology. So speaking of policies, let's do another poll. Again, I just want you to choose the answer that best fits where you are in your church's Gen AI policy development. So the choices are, do you have and the question is, do you have a policy on the use of Gen AI? Choices are, we have a policy, we don't have one, but it's a big priority for us. We're thinking about developing it, or we're not using it, and I don't think we need a policy. So I'll give about 15 seconds for folks to come up with the answer for that, and then we'll put the results on the screen. Okay, so many of you are thinking about it, and some of you think that you don't need a policy. Okay, and some of you, 5% of you have a policy. Yay! Oh, you're warming my heart. And another 7% of you are prioritizing the development of one. So that's great. We can go ahead and close those results, and we will move on to talking about policy development. There is a checklist that will be sent to registrants for this webinar. So you'll get both a copy of the slides and a checklist. And then if folks are viewing this in the future, they should be able to download that where they register to view the recording. The policy development steps are somewhat chronological, but you can likely work on more than one step at a time. The first step is to determine your policy direction and your statement of purpose. And you can do this by reviewing your theological beliefs, your statements of faith, resolutions, and other statements of witness, and determine how you want to move forward with this technology. So possible policy directions might be to prohibit the use of Gen AI models and Gen AI enabled applications, or what we call Gen AI tools, by church employees. So you might just want to prohibit it altogether. To proceed cautiously, bounded by the strict guidelines that you're going to set forth in the policy, or to encourage the use of Gen AI tools in accordance with the policy. Okay, so for those of you who don't think you need a policy, I do recommend having a policy, even if the church chooses to prohibit use, or if you are not using it at all, because you might not know that employees or volunteers may already be using Gen AI tools in their work. So I think even if the church's position is we're not going to use it, I think you need a policy statement that says that. Second, take a look at whether there are state or local laws limiting the use of Gen AI tools and whether those apply to your church. One good resource for this is the National Conference of State Legislatures website on artificial intelligence legislation in 2024. So I've included a link to that webpage in the policy development checklist, so you'll have that. If certain laws apply to your church, you'll want to make sure that the policy follows those laws. State and local laws are going to be changing all the time. So third, and I think this is critical, I strongly encourage surveying employees or volunteers about their current use of Gen AI tools, their familiarity with the technology, their concerns about it, and their overall interest in it. If you have a small number of employees or volunteers, this can be informal by just talking to people. If you have a larger number of employees or volunteers, you can do a more formal survey. At the national ministries, when we were developing our policy, we did a survey and we found that folks had a great range of concern and of, varying familiarity with the tools. While you're doing the survey, you can also start to think about a review and approval process for the implementation of the Gen AI tools that includes reviewing the data security of each tool. At a minimum, this should include reviewing the terms of service and privacy policy for each application so that you understand how it works and whether your church's information will be protected. Look, this is not leisure time reading. I understand that. But many terms of service I guess, I don't want to say in these days, many recent terms of service are actually written to be user-friendly. So they're not terribly difficult to read. They're boring, but they aren't difficult to read. So I would encourage you to do that. Once you have your survey and its results, you can review the tools that are already in use to determine whether the tools that are in use pose a risk to your church under your policy. So you'll also include a list of prohibitions in your policy. They may be, for example, to prohibit the use of Gen AI tools that don't provide adequate security safeguards, to prohibit employees from uploading sensitive data, to prohibit employees from using any Gen AI tools that haven't been approved for creating church content or using church data. Employees and volunteers who are engaged in creating content for the church really must be trained on the challenges in registering works with the U.S. Copyright Office that are created using Gen AI. So the U.S. Copyright Office has guidance on its website as to what can be registered and what can't. I've included a link to that in the checklist as well. So your church may choose to prohibit the use of Gen AI for materials that will be registered if you have any. Probably the most important policy point here is to require careful human review and ultimate human responsibility for output accuracy, for copyright infringement and plagiarism, and for compliance with the church's policies on bias and discrimination and any applicable laws. So regardless of whether you're going to choose to allow Gen AI or not, you're still going to have that ultimate human accountability. For disclosure obligations, this is a question that you'll have to determine is whether employees are required to disclose the use of AI. If the employee is required to disclose the use, is the disclosure internal to church operations only, or is it external to members and the wider church community? If your church is using Gen AI to write its newsletter, should that be disclosed? If your church is using Gen AI to write music for its Zoom meetings while people are gathering, should that be disclosed? Is your pastor using it to write sermons? That's definitely an area where you need to know your congregation and how that information will best be received. For those of you who are going to allow the use of Gen AI, consider providing prompt engineering training to employees who are using Gen AI regularly. If you're a pastor who's using it, you might want to seek out one of these courses as well. If you remember, we talked a little bit about prompt engineering at the beginning, and that's learning to write prompts to get better results. And obviously, employees need to be trained on the policy, and it needs to be updated as law and regulations develop and as the technology changes, which it will continue to do. I'm going to take this opportunity to address a few questions that I received prior to the webinar about the ethics of AI, and then we'll move into the questions that have come in during the presentation. The question was, is it possible, for an example, for an ethical firewall that would limit the ability to use AI to commit crimes? And what can be done to make AI-generated works stand out so that they aren't confused with actual reality? And are there any tools available for users to spot AI masquerading as reality? So these are really hard questions. And so number one, I would thank you for bringing these questions to the forefront. And number two, I don't think I'm going to be able to answer these adequately. I think these are possibilities, but I don't have a crystal ball to know where the regulatory framework is going to land. There's several organizations that have put out statements and recommendations on ethics in AI. UNESCO comes to mind. I'm sure there are others. And time will tell whether those ethics will be adopted and how they will be kind of enforced through the regulatory framework. I think a good place to start for oneself is simply by being aware that these technologies exist, that they're heavily in use, and that the possibility for using them to commit crimes and to create environments that seem very real but are fake also exist. And so to approach what you see with a healthy dose of skepticism, in assessing those possibilities. And I realize that's an inadequate answer, but that's where we are for now. Chad, if you want to let me know what questions we might have coming through, I would be happy to try to answer them in the time that we have remaining.
Excellent. Thank you, Heather. Yes, we do have a couple questions, and thank you everyone for getting these questions in. First question is in reference to Microsoft Office PowerPoint. Is it okay to use their design assistance for items that we put on our website? So as you design?
Yeah, so I think this question is getting towards whether you're violating, copyright. And I think that those tools that are provided by PowerPoint in terms of design are probably come along with a license for you to use that you can in their terms of service.
Excellent, thank you. Then we have one from Jacob Risto. Could you speak to the intersection of AI and privacy? And you already kind of talked about this, but I want to make sure we hit this. I've heard of AI companies training their models on users' data and media without their consent. If anything, that gives me pause is not to use the technology. But tech companies stored history of invading users' privacy. So I think you touched on that, but is there anything else we need to add to that based on that question?
So yeah, I think there's several ways that it intersects with privacy. And the question touched on one of the big ways. The one that's currently being litigated now is, they're taking data from people and are using it to train their models. And, that's a legal question that's already being litigated. And then the second question is, I think it's also a privacy issue when folks are able to take the likeness, the appearance, the voice, the image, the behavior of a person and make that likeness do something that the person did not do, I think is a real privacy problem. So I do think those privacy concerns are, they're definitely there. They're definitely being addressed both through litigation on the data end and regulation, at least by the states right now, and being considered by Congress on the likeness end.
Excellent. We have a question here from Jim Jensen. Do you know of any agreements that data storage facilities, such as OneDrive, Dropbox, etc., have released safeguarding stored data from AI harvesting?
That's a great question. I can't answer that. I'm not. I assume that they probably do exist. I'm not sure which companies have addressed that. I know a lot of companies are under fire by saying, because they've allowed it to happen maybe without the user's knowledge, and companies are walking, back a lot of that access. There were, Zoom was highlighted in the news several months ago for changing its policies, which it now states that it no longer allows third parties to use that data in training their AI models. So I'm sure that there are, and you would just have to go company by company to see what's out there.
Excellent. And then a couple more if we have the time. I think we do. Linda asks, can you ask an AI model to cite its sources or give a brief bibliography along with its output in response to your prompts?
So that's a great question. Yes, you can ask it, but what you get back may or may not be accurate, and you certainly can't rely on it. And that's specifically disclaimed in the terms of service for ChatGPT is don't rely on this for accurate information. So you might be able to ask it and it might put something out, but whether it actually relied on that or it's just giving you essentially a bibliography that it thinks you want, is an open question.
Excellent. Here's one from Hannah Rice. Are there proper ways to cite use of AI? Like in the bulletin when AI is used to help write liturgy or in the description of live streamed services?
Hi, Hannah. So I don't think so. Are there proper ways to do it? There's not one accepted way yet. I think I've seen it done a number of different ways. I've seen, statements that this was generated using, whatever the name of the software is. So I don't think that there is one acceptable way yet to do that.
Okay, excellent. Here's one from Lawrence Gibson. Talks about, for those of us with youth groups, can you talk about church policy with regards to deepfake nudes of minors? I know this is a big issue unfolding at the local and federal level, and I'd appreciate your advice on this. As a former youth pastor, we had to deal with this issue with the reels, but never those generated by AI.
Yeah. So I think what is probably being asked is, what do we do if we find out that youth group members have created these or are circulating them? And I think that probably is something that should be incorporated into your church's abuse prevention and harassment policy, that is not behavior that is tolerated. And then whatever discipline will happen under that policy, whether that is, in some instances, I think you would have to report that in terms of mandatory reporting for minors. But again, that is state specific under the law. So I think that is something that would have to go into your abuse prevention and harassment policy.
Excellent. And we'll go with one more. Last one here. Do you think the conference or association should create certain policy on Gen AI now?
So I'm not sure whether this is a question asking whether the conference or association should create policy for churches, because in the United Church of Christ, which is the denomination that I'm from, and I recognize that we have folks on this call who are from a variety of denominations, the conference or association can't create policy that churches have to follow. If they're asking about whether the conference or association should create a policy for itself to use, yes, I think that every organization at this point needs a policy on generative artificial intelligence.
Excellent. Thank you, Heather. Well, we try to get to a majority of all the questions, but I think we're kind of running out of time here. So in closing, I'd just like to thank Heather for sharing her time and expertise with us today. And just to remind everybody that this recording will be sent out in the next week with the PowerPoint presentation and the checklist. And you can always find the material up on our website at www.insuranceboard.org under the online learning tab. So thank you all for attending. We appreciate you all. Have a great afternoon. And thank you again, Heather.
Thank you so much.